If you're creating something from scratch, how do you decide on the best artistic medium to use? Also, how would you turn a life-threatening personal event into an art exhibition? We'll learn about this in today's episode. Welcome to Half Hour Mentor. It's Ian Cleverden here, and welcome to my audio podcast series designed to help anyone who's looking for inspiration to develop both personally and professionally. In this series, I focus on the creative arts. I'm catching up with musicians, artists, authors, actors, but also speaking to some in the directing and strategic management fields of this wide-ranging industry. All of my guests have been carefully chosen, as each one of them has a really interesting backstory from which we can all learn. Today's episode is the second of a two-part interview with artist, photographer and filmmaker Megan Powell. If you've come to this episode first, I highly recommend pausing here and going back and listening to the previous episode, as it will put the content of what Megan shares with us shortly into a much clearer context. As well as being an independent artist, Megan is also a lecturer in art and design, creative technology and photography at the University of Salford, which is based in the northwest of England. Her own work tells the story of power and survivorship, told through a continuous narrative of judgment, death and rebirth, and her work is influenced by patterns in history, sociology and psychoanalysis, with language at the heart of her creativity. In the previous episode, we learnt about Megan's traumatic childhood experiences which, at various stages, inspired and encouraged her love of various art forms. In this second part of my interview with her, we find out about her experiences of studying at the Royal College of Art in London, and a random attempt on her life, which, incredibly, she turned into a multimedia exhibition in Manchester. I've used photographs from this exhibition as the profile pictures for both episodes with Megan's express permission. Throughout the discussion, you will also gain ideas on how you can develop your own creative skills. It's important to highlight, though, that in this episode we discuss some distressing themes. If you're affected by any of the topics discussed in today's episode, I've placed some support links in the show notes. Let's continue our amazing journey with Megan Powell. So in the previous part we were talking about your journey through. You got your degree, you got the first, which was fantastic. You started the teaching qualification, but then you went on to do an MA.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that journey then.
So, part of me was like, I'll apply to the Royal College of Art, they'll say no, and then I'll think of another plan. I was in the waiting room waiting for my interview with a guy that had gone to Eton, and I just thought, oh my God, this is so not my world. I don't know what I'm doing here.
And the Royal College of Art is in London?
Yeah, it's in South Kensington. It's now moved to Battersea. There's some of it's in Battersea now, but then it was like South Kensington, and it was incredible. I think there was some sort of like mythology about it, and I would speak to other people about this, that almost like you'd expect Disney dust to fall on you, and it wasn't like it made you into a successful artist, like obviously, because I'm not a famous successful artist. But what I did gain was, the education was incredible. The theoretical basis and understanding that I had, we studied psychoanalysis with photography. The lecturers just were beyond measure, particularly like Ruth Blease Luxemburg and Sarah Jones, who were just such an incredible influence on me and made me understand my work in a really different way. The visiting lecturers, and I'm still really good friends with a lot of the people that I studied with who continue to influence me. What was difficult is being working class, having no fallback structure and having to make money whilst you were there.
So how did you cope with that?
So I worked at the Royal College of Art bar, which I made other friends there, which was great. And then I worked as a video editor and TV production assistant. Some of it was editing porn. I worked for a show called the International Sexy Ladies Show. I was the only female editor. It was it was an experience.
But probably paid quite well, I would imagine.
It paid pretty well, yeah, it was good. It was like, and also I could choose my own hours. I could kind of like turn up to the editing suite in Wardour Street it was. And I could, as long as I logged my hours, I could work whenever, so I could leave for a lecture and then come back. I worked for a clothes exchange store in Chelsea. I worked in a bar in Dalston. Just had so many, like, lots of different roles and jobs, and it was a juggling act.
Wow.
Yeah, but my work changed significantly. That structure of having lectures and seeing so many different things and being explained having so many different theoretical models that you're introduced to, and then having crits each week and seeing people from all around the world explain their work in such diverse. It was such a pleasure. I'm so grateful of it. The friends that I still talk to from my year group, we always say, because now we're all lecturers, and we go, oh my God, we can really see just how incredibly lucky we were to receive that level of education, you know. Look, I also did an internship for Nganda at the same time, so I could just had so many things happening.
So how many things were you juggling at the time then?
At one point I had 5 different jobs and a full-time MA. I lived in this place that was almost like a legalised squat. There was wires coming down from the ceiling. There was a silverfish infestation. It was definitely not legal the way that it was, but it was cheap, so we could afford it. You know, money was like such a battle. And then, after graduation, I got a job teaching for an international school set up by Central St Martin's. So that gave me a bit of breathing space, yeah.
So, from the MA then, let's talk about your own artwork and that. So, what sort of exhibitions, what did you put on, what did you learn from all of that educational experience?
I think I learned how to apply my theory to my work in a much more kind of sophisticated way, even though I was like reading Lacan within my BA and I was really fascinated. I think because there'd been issues with mental health in my family, that once I really started seriously learning psychoanalysis, I was like, oh my God, this is a structure, I can understand it. So it kind of made the chaos of that translate into something more structured. And I was always obsessed with wanting to find a pattern to something, so I could, in something tangible, so the irrational and the chaos could become something that was more legible and like clarity, because the whole of my upbringing was so unclear and confusing that I liked the rigidity of structures. My final piece was called New Articulations of All and Sundry. And it was actors playing out recordings from psychics that I'd been to see. Right. And it was a female protagonist who was basically being coached by a male mentor into learning language.
And what medium were you using?
Video.
Here?
I shot it with false projection backgrounds, or with like a rehearsal space at the Moving Image Studio, which was incredible. It was this massive building that you could like professionally film. I had actors come in to do it. I wrote scripts. It was about different streams of language which you have to cipher through and decide on how to individuate and how to attempt to self-actualize, and the power dynamics that can be seen within that. So I did that. I did some work about bees again, because I'd started making work about bees in like 2005. We had an exhibition at Wolston Home Projects as part of the Liverpool Biennial in 2010, curated by Morgan Quintance. I'd figured out on my BA this way of making work, of making very different pieces of work and trying to fit them together. So it was nonsensical. Yeah, so kind of looking at rigidity of art mediums and structures and style and sensibility, and then piecing them together.
Yeah. You mentioned about bees as well, because bees, they focus a lot in your work.
Yeah.
And why? What's the thing about bees that has attracted you to that in the art that you produce?
Initially, it was something quite unconscious. My experience of being in Spain on Erasmus was such a sense of belonging for me. That there was such a great community with the other students, that when I came back that summer, I was like really almost like a bit heartbroken to be back in Manchester. I was a little bit like, oh God, that amazing thing's over, and I've got to go back to waitressing and
Because you didn't have to work when you were out in Spain.
Yeah, and I had to waitress all that summer on the lead up. You know, I'd not really seen anyone for quite a while. I didn't know who my friendship... Well, I did know who my friendship groups were, but it's like reintegrating yourself into life. And I kept on seeing dead bees on the floor. I think I must have been walking with my head down, looking at the pavement, and I kept on seeing dead bees everywhere, and I started collecting them in pots. And
was this in Spain?
No, in Manchester when I got back. And then I remember there being lots of reports on Radio 4. I was listening to a lot of Radio 4 at the time, saying that bees were dying out. And I think basically this was like within the time frame of the Iraq War. And I remember thinking at the time, wouldn't it be interesting if our apocalypse came from something so tiny and seemingly innocuous as a bee, than from all the conflicts that are happening.
It was quite a metaphor, really, wasn't it, for what was going on?
And I felt like our attentions weren't there. So then I started working with the National Beekeeping Association at Heaton Park, and it was something that I didn't really know what it was. And I continued that a bit in my MA, but also I became obsessed with language. I'm still obsessed with language. I'm obsessed with lots of different ways in which we can consider the world and what are the patterns between academic languages and what are the differences. Basically, I started looking at the language of the hive. And I don't know if anybody who has been a beekeeper and been exposed to the hive will understand this, that it's absolutely mesmerizing. And lots of times when you're there, you know, you can accidentally kind of keep the hive open longer than you should do, just because the functionality of the hive, and because I like psychoanalytical ways of thinking, I thought that it was like a Winnicottian safe base. I thought the structure and the coordination and the collaboration between the hives and the individuals was something really interesting.
Wow.
So then I would interview lots of different people. So I began interviewing beekeepers, but then I would get biologists and different scientists, but then I would get different theorists to translate those things. So if you talk to a psychoanalyst about the language of the bees, speak to a priest, speak to a spiritualist, speak to a social worker who mainly used to work, I was talking to kind of sociologists and social workers to really kind of dissect what linguistically that could mean.
So how do you then turn that into an art form? From all that research that you've done and speaking to all those different people, how do you then get that out into a art form, sort of into a medium?
So I would make films, short films. I would have lots of writing. I mean, eventually that project, once I had left London and came back to Manchester, turned into an Arts Council grant, and there was a documentary narrated by Maxine Peake, which went into all of these things. So all those interviews, yes, become part of the script. I think I'm more interested in the process of making work than I am with any outputs that I do. In fact, I feel quite disappointed when I have to have an exhibition. It's like I feel very ambivalent, and I'm more interested in what is discovered during process.
There's quite a lot of parallels with musicians in that form, where the creative and making the album, for example, is the best part of it, and then once the album's out there, you just want to move on.
Yeah, as soon as I make a piece of work, I'm not interested in it.
Interesting.
I'm not, and I always I hate an exhibition. An exhibition opening is the most painful experience because I instantly reject it once it's there. I experience great ambivalence with it. I don't want, because it feels like an untruth for me.
But would it not be celebratory at the moment that your exhibition's there to think, look what I've achieved?
I mean, it can be that for other people. For me, not so much. No, I don't enjoy it. I don't like it. There's very few pieces of work that I'd say maybe out of over 20 years of making work, maybe I've got 5 pieces at a push that I'm that's nearly there. Yeah. The rest of it is the process of it, I'm yes, I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
How do you decide the type of medium to use, whether it's going to be a video, whether it's going to be photography, and blend a bit of mixed media? How do you make that decision?
when I was younger, really intuitively. Like, I intuitively felt how it should be. In fact, I was just speaking to my friend Johnny Briggs about this, who's also an artist, much more successful than me. It felt like I was making work when I was younger, but I didn't understand it. And only now am I, like, retroactively understanding what that was and how it fits in and how it makes sense. And I think there are lots of different ways in which you can make and consider your work. That kind of very unconscious, intuitive approach is really valid, but we can reject it if we don't know the full meaning or understanding of it, when actually that can come much later with experience. So it's sometimes, it can be detrimental to have to speak about things that we don't yet realise. It's a little bit how the experiences of your life retroactively activate into new significances in the present day. If you have an argument with your mother when you're a teenager, if you then have your own teenage daughter, that argument will mean something different because you've inhabited those both positions.
You're sitting in the other chair, aren't you?
Yeah. And that happens with your artwork.
Yeah.
That actually the significance of what you've made at that time retroactively becomes something else on top of more work that you make. And I think that's really important to kind of be mindful of. What you're making now might not be apparent to you, but the significance, it's really important to be patient with yourself. You don't have to be all things. Some students that I'm just like, oh my God, they are such amazing photographers, but maybe they don't know what it means yet. And that is fine. That is absolutely perfect for now, because give it 15 years, it will mean something totally different. But focus on what that strength is. Don't stop taking images because you don't understand the greater significance of your work yet. Artwork is iterative. It will repeat on you, and every time it repeats, it will gain a new significance and mean something very different. And that's what maturity is. That's what aging is.
What first drew me to our discussion today was when I saw the BA students exhibition in the summer. Within, on the 7th or 8th floor, whatever it was, of the building that we're in now, and the difference in the work, although that was work that they had submitted for their portfolio and they'd been marked on, the difference in the work and the approach was just amazing. I
think that's something. So I like critical psychoanalysis because it tells you about how you individuate, so how you become an individual, how you gain language in order to understand your individuality, how you go through maturation stages, how this is a really difficult process. This is why, teenage years are chaotic, because you're in the midst of very difficult maturation stages, and this is universal for everybody. But actually, those patterns of what maturation, individuation is, gaining language, understanding what is yours and what is other people's, that's what artists go through. They're trying to say, well, who am I as an artist or a creative person in the world? Where do I place myself? And that can be one of the hardest challenges, especially if you have a student who's doing something really unique and it can't be coined yet. Actually, the more that you don't understand what you're doing in some cases, the more individual it is, the better it is, because it means that if you can't find a placement for it, that's something super unique.
It's an exhibition that you had that was called Get Stabbed and Boogie, and I'm intrigued about the title. And what inspired that?
It was a personal experience. So a year after I graduated from the RCA, I was randomly attacked by 3 men and stabbed in the face, which was an attempted murder case. I was stabbed a millimetre away from my eye, and it went into the side of my face. I had a reconstructive surgery on my face and go into witness protection because it was by a gang. Yeah, so it was that. I think, basically at the time that it happened, my friends were around me like a vacuum, which was incredible. When I had to have the surgery on my face, which saved my eye, saved my life, when I was discharged from hospital, I was living with my friend Graham Clayton Chance at the time, and my friend Damien Callahan came to stay with me, and I got drunk, which was very stupid because you're not supposed to have anaesthetic and drink, and I got them to photograph me dancing with the face cast on, and then I didn't touch that work for years. I wanted to document myself in this kind of it was unconsciously defiant because I wasn't really thinking what that would be, but what I did do is I documented my face constantly throughout that process. So from the day the attack happened right through to it healing, I got other people, or I documented my face. And you know, I'm exceptionally lucky. Like the doctor said to me, I do not understand how you're not blinded or dead. So to come out of it without really a scar or anything, it was a miracle. But then I think with the rise of the Me Too movement and what that was, I got really curious about what a survivor narrative is. And because also I'd come from a very violent upbringing, I was a little bit like, oh God, this again, what is it that keeps on repeating? Why has violence been so prevalent in my life? Like what? And then I thought, God, I didn't want to have any of the survivor narratives available. I felt like I didn't want to attach to, and I wanted to explore it in a different way. So it was at Paper Gallery, which is now closed down. I basically thought, what if I approached this situation like disco, like the disco movement? I used to go to Horse Meat Disco all the time on a Sunday night. I loved that movement. And actually, what is really interesting about disco is that it has a really kind of rebellious history. It began as kind of anti-Nazi protest music in World War II. It then kind of, as it navigated towards New York, it mixed with Afrobeats. Lots of disco music, even though it has this kind of really happy sensibility about it, is talking about the LGBTQIA plus community and for civil rights as well. It was a place where anyone who felt otherized could play together within this air of glamour. So I wanted it to be like that. So the work was reusing these images, these snapshots of me dancing, and I threw glitter over it all, used glitter paper, had things printed really cheaply. So I wanted this lo-fi DIY way about it. I didn't really want it to be with any... so basically, because the Royal College of Art was basically like a finishing school, but I felt like that type of finished, polished way of making work didn't align with my story. I'd come from a very feral past, and so I wanted it to have these kind of quite dynamic but lo-fi ways of working. Had a picture of me where I'm looking directly at the camera printed on an advertising banner, the same sort of banner that would be on a roundabout, and that says "Happy Birthday, Linda." That sort of cheap,
vinyl type, yeah.
I put disco lights in there, and I made a playlist. I wanted to undermine myself. Yeah, I wanted to kind of undermine myself and undermine what that was. So there was disco lights going around the images. There was lots of images. There was images of a nun that I'd taken. There were kind of some staged images there that my friend Fiona posed for. I was looking at that very kind of cliche trope of Madonna whore, because they'd called me a white whore, basically. And it was a process measure. And I think, the playlist, I wanted it to be silly. Boogie's such a silly word. I wanted it to be absurd and ridiculous.
Well, that's what caught my attention, was the get stabbed and boogie. It's what is that about?
Yeah.
And it really draws you in.
And it's interesting. So I think talking about that, at the time that I was doing it, yes, I was interested about, well, how do you carve your own way with your own survivor narrative? Most things in life that are really hard, that are really difficult stages for you, are also kind of ridiculous as well. There's such an absurdity, and that's where dark humour comes in, that we're able to kind of twist those things, and that's also how you gain power in disempowering situations, to be able to apply those perspectives. I mean, at the time that I did that exhibition, I just left one therapist and hadn't yet arrived at the next. So that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. Anyone who is doing that sort of personal work should definitely be within a therapeutic relationship that they really trust and have that really safe base of a psychodynamic where you can exercise these things. Because when I did start seeing my current therapist, who I've been with now for I think nearly 4 years, who's incredible, he said that was a manic defense. And I was like, yeah, that's really interesting. It was a manic defense and it wasn't safe for me to do. Even though now when I look back, I think it's my favorite exhibition because it was just so frivolous and ridiculous and I wasn't precious about the work. So that was one exhibition and piece of work actually that I did that I didn't cringe at. Everything else makes me cringe.
How was it received?
I think it was received quite well. I don't think I was really doing it to be received. I wasn't in a good way, I don't think. I think it was important, but I think what it was a projected fantasy. I wanted the fantasy of me surviving an attempted murder with grace, with like it was easy, like nothing touched me, like I was superhuman, which was not the case. Like I was a mess. You know, I got put in witness protection. I didn't have a family that I could go stay with. It basically was like me being back in the care system again. And I was like, great, here again. And I had to start afresh. You know, I had panic attacks all the time. I would go blind. My health was doing crazy. It was just such an awful thing. So to have a projected fantasy that is disco, like, oh God, that was so easy. Look at me, I just breezed through it. That is such an appealing thing to want to, as it for a narrative tone. That projected fantasy is how you want others to see you. In actual fact, it's not the case. It was a much more messy, convoluted, not okay healing process. And I think for anyone who goes through those sorts of things, patience is so important. I think lots of times we want to be seen like, oh no, I'm fine, I've dealt with that, look at my resilience, when it's like, no, like you're allowed to be a mess, you know, give yourself grace. Yeah. I think, because I worked for Rape Crisis after that, and we looked at the patterning of like, there was something in our culture that basically said, if you'd gone through awful attacks, that you had to be successful to make sense of that. Like there was a binary, like you have to be Beyonce if you've been through abuse. And it's like, no, you have to just learn to get up that day and brush your teeth if you're able to. That's the only thing you have to do. Let's start it small. Let's stop putting expectations on survivors and let everybody carve their own path with it, because there's so many things of like, you're celebrated if you become successful and you've been through something now. That's really toxic. Me Too is great that it's happened, but there's also, we need to consider the language of which we speak to survivors with. The police kept on saying to me, you're a good victim. And I thought, oh, that is so awful. And I just thought of all the people that they would consider not good victims and thought, this is disgusting. I do not want to be part of this narrative because I know exactly what you're doing. I'm a good victim because you think I'm middle class because I've just been to the Royal College of Art. I'm white, and like all of these horrible things, like the undertones of racism that I experienced with them. I was like, the London Met, I thought, this is awful and I don't want to be connected to this.
There's a whole mix of unconscious bias there.
Yeah, so much that is still happening today. Like, I feel really awful the fact that other women and trans women would have gone through the same thing as me and would have been treated differently, because that experience was horrendous for me. So think about all those other people. How have they been treated? There's so much bias still in culture. There is, and we think that we've made all these headways, but I think it's just the beginning. Yeah.
There'll be lots of people listening to this, amateur creatives, for example. That we have media available to us. Everybody's a photographer because they've got a smartphone. For somebody who wants to break out into the creative arts world and make a success of it, I know it's a general question, but what advice would you give them?
Depends the reasons for why you're doing it. if you want to make money, trying to be an artist is a silly way to do it. You know, it's usually that there's some other drive. You have other drives there, other reasons for doing it, and that should be your focus. You know, become conscious and congruent and self-aware with what your process is, what you're trying to do. I think that congruence in your work is the absolute kind of number one thing. And then find a comfortable position with it. How do you like to make? Why are you making? How do you do it? What joy do you get from that process? Yeah, and then there's lots of streams you could do. I mean, degrees are still a great way forward, you know. Traditional educational systems, they do still work. I mean, they're starting to fall apart, I think. If we stay with this government, they'll fall apart. But then there's lots of organisations in which you can do things with. It's interesting because creativity is really innate in us. There's cave paintings, mark making, it's something that's completely innate. But then we try to put this kind of idea of commercialisation and economy to it. And sometimes those things don't mix.
Megan, thanks ever so much for spending that time and your honesty and just, you sort of bearing your soul really, which has influenced the great work that you've done. I've got one final question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, knowing what you know now, after all of that experience, what one piece of advice would you give that younger self, perhaps, that Megan that was in the care home?
Yeah, oh God. I do think you learn things as you're meant to learn them. But I think I would have wanted to be able to focus on myself more. Like when I was younger, I used to think that I was a response object and that I was only there to have to help other people. So I would constantly give my energy away to others rather than learn self-care, which is like everybody should definitely learn positive selfishness, learn self-care, put yourself first, but also power. I think lots of all my work now is about language and power. And I think when you go through lots of disempowering situations, to learn how to use power ethically is like one of the greatest things that you can learn. So how to be in your power and to be, it sounds like a meme, doesn't it? But kind of like kind with it. Like I make mistakes all the time. I'm not trying to say that I don't. But I think that there's something really important in my lifetime that I've had to learn about power, that I'm still learning. But I wish I would have not been so destabilized by other people's power imbalances with me when I was younger. Yeah, I would have maybe got further than I've got if I would have learned that sooner, maybe.
Megan Powell, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
I'm sure you'll understand, having listened to both episodes, why I could not distill Megan's story down into 30 minutes. Putting aside all the inspirational advice and guidance that Megan shared in the interview, what we also had here was a masterclass in resilience. I can't personally begin to imagine how I would deal with an attempt on my own life, let alone revisit it through an art form. How do you feel about that? However, I was interested to learn about her attitude to the launch of an exhibition, which is very similar to some of the reactions I've had from the songwriters I've interviewed. Once your latest work is out there in the public domain, you want to move on to something else. The difference with musicians, though, especially songwriters, is that they need to stay attached to this work for some time through touring in order to bring in an income, even though they may simultaneously be creating their next magnum opus whilst they're out on the road. Huge thanks go from me to Megan for her honesty, openness and mentorship in what turned out to be a hugely engaging 2 episodes. As mentioned at the start, if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in my interview with Megan, I've placed links to relevant support helplines in the show notes. Here's a spoiler alert, folks. My next guest will also be a 2-part interview, but on a completely different theme. If you're enjoying these episodes, please follow the series wherever you get your pods, if you haven't already done so, and do review the back catalogue if you're new to the series. Please also share them with anyone whom you think will gain benefit from the content. You can leave feedback about the episode through social media by searching for Half Hour Mentor or via the email link in the show notes. I'd love to know what you think of these episodes, so please do get in touch. Thanks for listening, and until next time, bye for now.